Right. So we want to get to a place of wholeness and a stronger baseline, a stronger foundation, a more equitable one for all helping in relationships as well. And the metaphor of the tree is that to thrive uh, in all the branches and all the people that we have, whether they're students, clients, the public, the whole population, we need a collectively stronger and safer environment where everyone can be visible, everyone can thrive, be represented in knowledge and voice and so on, and be equipped to be able to, at a baseline, to be able to work with all things equal everyone rather than only particular groups or particular centered on particular people. Yeah. So that's the vision, a healthy root, a healthy branches, healthy trunk, and healthy leaves. So the purpose of embedded practice is the idea was actually to look at what is the common ground of knowledge that we have already that we work in the mainstream of. And that's right at the roots. The image of the self, the theory, the self-development, the skills, and everything else. We can't embed anywhere else apart from in the roots because that's where everything starts from. That's the seed. And that's what can lead us, I believe, to a more um, collectively stronger and equitable design for sustainable helping and so on. So the current landscape, I won't go too much into this. We probably understand it a bit more already. Our primary knowledge is based on three schools of psychotherapy, humanistic, cognitive behavioral, and psychodynamic, psychoanalytical. So as an essence of that is that it's very much the contextual knowledge centralized within that, and mainstream of knowledge is based on that. It's decontextualized, there's no context, there's no social context formalized in it. Obviously, there's other adaptations that have gone on later on. But the problem with that is that it replicates into the professional structures, our own culture, and ultimately in client practice. So that then applies there, that everyone's a human being without context. That's the risk of that. Secondary knowledge is about contextualized practice fundamentally and decentered practice. So we're talking about things like cultural competency, we're talking about neurodivergence, neurodiversity, queer theory, we're talking about worldviews, religion and spirituality and ultimate beliefs. We're talking about many other things that I haven't mentioned. Obviously, then there's identities, intersectional identities, and also the embodiment of stress, trauma, and harm. Although they are more accepted now in terms of the way we train and do things, but they're not sort of embedded, if that makes it across the whole thing. So we need to think about that as well and not assume that that is all okay. The body itself needs to be embedded. EDI is another example of organizational level ideas, but currently in the UK, we seem to be focusing then on the EDI being embedded, which means all this secondary stuff really as well. So in the secondary scheme of things, it's contextualized, it's decentered, but the problem is that separation replicates into the professional structures and client practice. The separation exists through the binaries of there's something called people A and there's something called people B that we work with. And therefore the contextual knowledge only appears when we think about certain diverse, different people. This is actually very wrong, and it's othering, it's alienating, and it's inhibiting and dehumanizing as well. So that's the barrier, that's the challenge, and that's the solution that we need to overcome. There's barriers. We see these as add-ons, later stage add-ons and so on. You probably all understand this roughly that. So this is sort of just take that as a sort of framing of what we want to overcome. So what I'm going to present is 4 steps that will actually get us there in terms of ourselves, and the cultural institution and structures to be able to reseed something at the ground of therapy. The first step is to change the view of the self and experience. In the mainstream primary approaches, we think of experience like this. You see it in pictures, you see it in books, you see it in the theories, the way we talk about and our discourse about the self. We primarily think about the self-experiencing in this way. This is the imprint, I would argue, in most of our minds about the self and the person we inhabit. So we think that is representative of us. This is the issue because there is gaps in fuller understanding of experiences. Where did these experiences come from in the first place? What are the originating factors that lead to that particular interpersonal or inner experience of ourself, self-worth, helplessness, powerlessness, and so on? So this form of working is exclusionary because it invisibilizes all those contexts. And therefore, because it's invisibilizing those contexts, it replicates into the culture in that way. So the seed is actually constrictive. It doesn't represent the whole population for a start. It may represent more normativity. It doesn't represent particular types of knowledge, particular voices, lived experiences. It doesn't. It constricts empathy, especially for when we're talking about difference in any form, and it hides also the barriers and needs of the individuals in the context they live in as well. So I would propose that is actually the ground of therapy, and it fragments ourselves and groups to later stage adaptations, later stage thinking, or even, you're not represented in the experience. You have to wait for that experience or the topic to come up to talk about it. And if you're lucky, it'll be covered, but if you're unlucky, it won't be covered at all. So what is the solution for that is this is the Wicket model. It's the same experiential model that you had before. Nothing has changed, nothing is lost. This has come out from a deeper sense of analysis, looking at all the secondary approaches, looking at a full view of what forms experience. And this is the model the book proposes for training and training curriculum. It must start with this on day one, and it has to then carry on throughout the process, whatever the learning is. Because if the first imprint is applied, then we will never get to a point, I believe, of wholeness, because we'll always be thinking about separateness and separation and segregation, all that stuff. So therefore, this is the picture I would like to see imprinted in our minds as a starter. It doesn't take anything away, it represents the truth. It represents the truism of our existence. And hopefully it's quite intuitive because all it's saying is that our inner experiences about ourselves and our relational experiences are formed as an intersection, if you like, of all these things together coming in a moment in time, whether it's phenomenologically in the past, historically, ancestrally, intergenerationally, or collectively. So I'm not going to go into each one of these. It's in the book, you can read the framework, but essentially this is about our overarching belief systems, our social and personal hierarchies, the context of our life, the culture, the planet, our family context. Where does knowledge come from? What are we using as the basis of knowledge? Is it spiritual? Is it, non-Eurocentric and so on? What bodies do we inhabit? What patterns do those body experience? Survival instincts and so on come to that. An important part of the inclusion is the time category, because we aren't just ahistorical people. We carry a genetic payload in our through our bodies. We have intergenerational and collective histories and so on. So therefore, this view of the self strengthens understanding. So all those secondary approaches, communities, identities, things that are missing are represented in this model straight away. There is a second level diagram to this. But in essence, what this says, it gives permission to the students and ourselves to have the voice to talk about these areas. It won't inhibit us, it won't take anything away. A student coming in to practice and doing the curriculum, they see that, they see themselves represented in that, and then they can talk about language, they can talk about knowledge, they can talk about religion, they can talk about non-religion, whatever it is in that. So this is the day one activity for students. So inclusion, if we want to use wholeness, is via visibility of the self, and that is the answer. So the whole population is in there, they're representative. We can start empathizing with every part of ourselves, not just certain parts of ourselves, and the possibilities we have. This is the only thing this is the mandatory bit. We can't do universal design without this being embedded into our own minds. So the wholeness idea is represented through this seed. This is the seed of whole practice. The second step is to change the view of relationships. It might be quite surprising to hear that I'm challenging some of the gaps in the relationship understandings, but that's the central part of this. Our current model sees relationships in this way. We have an imprint in our mind. The way we talk about the relationships is very much around this type of model, that there are two human beings. We talk about experience, we describe experience, and then we apply theory to that, whatever that is. Maybe we talk about personal dynamics, his childhood histories. Why do I see this therapist as a terrible person? Whatever the barriers are in a relationship, and we try and overcome them. There may be a bit of an emphasis, especially in person-centered theory, around role power. So this is the issue. Doesn't explicitly consider self and lived in context in a relationship, doesn't formalize that. I'm not saying people don't do it. I'm not saying this is not, in that sense, it's not explicit enough. If it's not explicit enough, we're going to miss it in our trainings and the way we think about relationships. So the limited relational scope is exclusionary because of the lack of explicitness around context, whether it's class or belief systems. And the number three, individualized empathy may be inadequate, shallow, and harmful without explicitly embedding context into the relationship, something I call contextual empathy in the book. And without that, we can't be empathic always with clients because we may not have the knowledge to convert to pre-empathy to convert to empathy in the room. So therefore, I'll talk a bit more about that. And if you're from marginalized position or different positions and parts of you are different, you will understand that because you could not be seen fully in those contexts, and therefore the relationship may be inhibited or at worst harmful. So we need to revisit the relationship in a couple of ways. I haven't got all time to talk about this in depth. It's in the book. One of the issues we have is that we separate the relationship from the secondary approaches. This is the fundamental issue as I see it. When we talk about trauma-informed, when we talk about diversity and difference, cultural competency, and so on, neurodiversity, race, culture, class, gender, we see them as separate to the relationship. This is the fundamental issue. Okay. They are not separate to the relationship. They are the dimensions of the relationship, which may be very relevant to relating and so on. So that is the fundamental issue. An example of that would be, let's say we learn about trauma-informed practice. That's a piece of knowledge. Then we apply that to the relationship in a way that's caring and sensitive of the boundaries and what could be triggering for the client, re-traumatizing. That is a relational act. That is a healing act. So therefore, the secondary approaches aren't separate to the relationship, but the way we talk about them is as if they are. Second error is that we consider the relationship as a broad one. that is an error because it doesn't consider the fact that we are a multiplicity of relationships. So a therapist and a client relationship isn't one relationship. You may be having a very deep, vulnerable, um, openness the client is having with you, but doesn't mean parts of them are not restricted or exiled because of who you are as a therapist, the social positions, and so on. So therefore, we need to think of the relationship as a multiplicity of relationships, not just one relationship. And they could feed each other, but they are not one thing. And that's why the contextual relationship is important. And the third part of it is that when we talk about relationships, we understand them as a way of healing and understanding and empathy, which is fine, great. But the important part of this is the attunement to context. When we understand someone in their context, that's what gives rise to a better relationship. If we miss that, we miss attunement and understanding, and therefore we miss that in the way we respond to the client, whether that's empathic responding, whether that's a formulation, whether that's a conceptualization, whether that is a protocol intervention, however you want to call it. Relationships are built on the therapist understanding the client in their context as well, may be very important. So therefore, relationship is central to the issue that we're trying to solve, because the relationship has to include contextual empathic understanding as well as individualized understanding. Therefore, we need the idea of relational scope. Relational scope is something I've introduced in the book as another term that we need to consider, that the relationship is formed not only by under the surface talk or feelings, however you want to call it, at a particular time, but it's based on particular scope of parts. If we consider the relationship as a multiplicity, we can consider that the scope of the relationship is important. Which scope of the relationship is relevant to the client in this moment in time? Maybe it's about their political ideas and ideologies. Maybe it's about religion. Maybe it's about gender. Maybe it's about race, and so on. So therefore, the relationship should be thought about in as a multiplicity. So the scope of the relationship needs attention as well as just a universal relationship. So as you probably can guess, the 2B model of the relationship is this, where we apply the self in context embedded into the relationship. That is the central feature of this solution. That when we think about the multiplicity of relationships, there's nothing off the table in terms of the relationship. We may need to develop more of a attuned relationship with a person's belief systems, knowledge, their protected characteristics, or culture, whatever it is, for everyone, not just for certain individuals or groups. This is necessary for everyone. Everyone lives in a culture, everyone migrates, everyone has a social position, identity, and their experience is formed in that way. So we may need to relate to clients in different ways and to prove the fact that we understand them in their context and that we're on their side. So therefore, the dynamics of the relationship increase as well. It's not just about personal dynamics, it's contextual, it's about power, similarity and difference, and also communication and meaning, because that's a central part of the relationship. Do I understand the client and vice versa? Is it accessible? Do I get it, or am I out of sync with the communication as well? So the relationship has more dynamics that we need to make explicit for the objective that we're trying to achieve, which is universal foundational practice. And then we can add more layers. In the diagrams in the book, there's more layers to this as well. I'm not going to go through all of that. But another aspect of the relationship that's missing is that we need to consider not only relations between individuals and groups, but also interconnected and interdependent relationships as well. We have relationships with groups, with families, with communities, with society as a citizen or non-citizen, with the government. We have a relationship with the planet. Um, as institutions, we have a relationship with our institutions that we belong to in the profession and so on. These cannot be disassociated with, just like we can't disassociate ourselves from our social positions and identities either. So therefore, it's a more fuller, whole version of the framework for the relationship. So taking a breath there, that's the hardest part. So now we need to continually embed context. How do we do that? We simply apply the model, the WICET model, to every piece of knowledge and practice we have and ask questions of it and ask whether we are missing something that could be important, either working with a client or within a particular piece of knowledge. So the book represents the application of the model onto the book, onto the curriculum. So it asks what if questions. What if the client is living in a precarious position? How does that affect self-care? So it's asking questions. How does a relationship affected by our embodiment? It's asking a question. So the embodied to embodied relationship is about, why do I feel a bit nervous around this client? Why do I feel withdrawn? Why do I feel anxious? So therefore, the framework provides the model for embedded practice, whether we talk about self-development, various skills, practice, research, supervision, ethics, competencies, and so on. So that is the solution. It has to be accessible, it has to be freely, easily doable, if you like. So that is the ongoing thing that we individuals and tutors and so on supervise, we all need to be doing just as a sort of check or self-check that we aren't universalizing a particular piece of knowledge as the universal absolute truth. We are applying that, including differences in knowledge bases and methods as well. Okay, so that's step 3. And step 4 is probably the easier one. Well, not easier one, it's probably the hardest, but easiest to understand it, is that we need to think structurally, consciously. All things equal, we need to ask, can we serve the whole population? Who would be more advantaged or disadvantaged in our proficiency, our structure, as well as by cultural and service barriers? So this is an exercise we would do with the students to understand the area. And we would ask, in the book, it asks people as students to be learning about, all of us need to do this, being service orientated. In other words, what is the scope of my service? What are the limits of it? Who would be included and who wouldn't be included by that? So this is the sort of model introduced in the book where we talk about our position in a service provision, but it's private practice or a big organization. What are the socio-cultural and structural influences? What are the barriers to access for individuals and the whole population? We would talk about what it means to provide equitable efficiency, a culture that's based on that seed of practice. It has to relate to relationships within the organizations. What is the service design we are delivering? And therefore, we have to then emphasize then the scope of it. What modalities, what are the adjustments, what are the accessibility needs, who will be able to access it, who won't be able to access it, being honest about that. What are the adjustments of flexibility we need, interpreters, communications, how responsive will be, what's the environment going to look like? Is it going to be suitable neurodivergent people or people who have sensory needs or whatever it is, but as a standard rather than for particular groups of people. We need to make it standardized so it's whole for everyone, is available for everyone. So the summary then is the relationship is the key to whole embedded design. it makes it easy for us because actually it's something we very much know about, and we just need to augment it. By doing that, it becomes stronger and more equitable by increasing the relational scope of the relationship. It invites people in because it's actually a model that says you are included here, you can talk about these areas, and the possibilities are there for attuned relationships, both in the student experiences and in daily life. And the other good thing about the relational approach is that it retains the modality integrity in the modality itself. All that needs to happen is they need to extend it, the relational scope, to understand that conditions of worth, for example, are extended towards the context of a person's life. And these are mandatory for universal design. And without it, we cannot do inclusion, if they want to call it that, or the way we talked about this wholeness, I don't think can be achieved without this type of baseline of understanding and knowledge. And that's it. The curriculum is in the book. We'll obviously improve it over time. That's fine. And I guess the conversation I think I'd like to have really is about advocacy. So far, we've had good take up in terms of the professional organizations, training providers, and tutors asking about the model, using it with students. And we also have someone this organization, NAOS, which will implement the model from day one in their course in 2026. So the question, therefore, is what can we do to advocate? Do we agree with this model? What are the barriers, perhaps? Or what are the things we haven't thought about? And what can we do?